The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. And that is the most important part, is to realize our true nature, because everyone has it. We are all embodied in true nature. And so there's no way out of it. You may as well find it and use it to become free. Because when you recognize your true nature and opt out of the story that you've lived with for so long, there's a tremendous amount of peace, freedom, and ability to maneuver through any kind of circumstance, no matter how difficult, with ease and without being caught in it. That is what can happen if you have a very deep entry into understanding of your true nature. And that is what we work towards here. Today is the 7th and final day, this month anyway, of this October Sesshin in 2022 at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And of course, we have 2 more Sesshin coming up before the end of the year, November and Rohatsu. And then we start again with the double Sesshin in the springtime. It's important to practice as deeply as possible, because we never know how long this life will last. And at this point, we have a connection with Zen practice, and we have a way to do it. And so to take advantage of that is an enormous gift. And as I said, we don't know when we might come back to that gift again. It is not only ultimately freeing of ourselves, but it is ultimately freeing of all beings. Because the more free we are, and that doesn't mean license, that means truly be free to function without hindrance in any circumstance in the most compassionate and wise way. It impacts all beings. So today I would like to share something of the life of Kuei Shan, who was a Chinese master. He predates Rinzai, and his teacher was Baichang. Baichang's student was the teacher of Rinzai, but not Kuei Shan. And Kuei Shan, there's a koan in which Kuei Shan is an attendant to his teacher, and his teacher, the fire is getting low. It must be winter or late fall or early spring in China, and the fire is getting low. So Baichang asked his student to check the fire and see if there's a spark somewhere. And Kuei Shan looks, sifts through it with the poker, and doesn't find one. So he says, there isn't one. And so Baichang says, well, let me take a look myself. And he looks and he stirs it up, and he finds a tiny spark. And he shows it to Kuei Shan and says, isn't this fire? At which point Kuei Shan became awakened. Surely Kuei Shan was on the verge, otherwise it wouldn't have happened. And awakening happens after deep, ongoing search for our true nature. Except we can't say, I'm looking for my true nature, because that's a word. And our true nature is not definable in words. It is beyond words. So, who are we? Later, Kuei Shan founded his own lineage, and one of his students had a sort of a similar experience. Let me share this with you. This is from The Golden Age of Zen, which was originally translated by John Wu, and has been out for a very long time. And my Dharma brother, who has since died of very painful cancer, Kenneth Kraft, who was a wonderful translator and a professor of religion, edited it and wrote a foreword. So here is what is said. It says, this hidden spark of fire may be regarded as the symbol of Kuei Shan. By a coincidence, the enlightenment of Yang Shan, Kuei Shan's disciple, who was destined to be his co-founder of the house, occurred as a result of a dialogue in which the master mentioned the power of the divine spark. The power of the divine spark. So what was Baicheng trying to point out to Kuei Shan when he was looking for that spark in the fire, in the ashes? Each of us has that spark within us, and it burns brighter and brighter as we continue our practice and clear the air, so to speak, of what inhibits our experiencing that bright spark. To continue, on that occasion, Yang Shan's question was about the abiding place of the true Buddha. In reply, Kuei Shan said, by the ineffable subtlety of thinking without thinking, turn your attention inward to reflect on the infinite power of the divine spark. When your thinking can go no further, it returns to its source. Where nature and form eternally abide, where phenomenon and noumenon are not dual, but one, it is there that abides the suchness of the true Buddha. And that's basically what it says in the scroll behind me. Of course, at the top is the Enso, which represents our true nature, since there's no words that can represent it, and that's actually not a picture of it either, because it cannot be pictured. But behind the Kuan Yin, which is standing in front of it, are the words, out of not one thing arise the 10,000 things. And that not one thing is when phenomena and noumena become one. There is not a single thing. But in accordance to causes and conditions, things arise. And we arise, for that matter, because out of karmic conditions, we ourselves have been born and have reached a point where we're sitting in a sendo in New Mexico, working on practicing Zen and seeing that true nature, uncovering that out of not one thing, because it can be realized. And when Kuei Shan said, when thinking with not thinking, return to the source. This is the same as the Korean master said, turn the light of your eyes inward and trace the radiance down to its source. This is the same thing it says in the Christian Bible when it says, and God made all things. Early Christians had to name it something. Early practitioners of all the major religions had to name it something. The Great Father, Allah, God, many names, but at the source, it is this profound, out of not one thing arise the 10,000 things. And in realizing even a little bit of this, we can become more and more free. And of course, here we emphasize the need not just to realize it, but to make it real in our lives. To open to a Kensho, and then another Kensho, and then further Kensho experiences, and further deepening in our awareness and our expansion of that awareness. an expansion of that understanding. And then within that, even before we have a kensho, we can become aware of habit patterns that have defined our lives, that have driven our lives. And traditionally, we were taught to ignore those and only focus on the koan. However, that results in what John Wellwood, a psychotherapist who practiced meditation and was a psychotherapist, called making an end run around your issues. When we talk about awakening, we mean awakening of the whole being. We don't mean having insight into how things are. We mean having that insight and then seeing how we are not living in accord with that insight. And that is more important, actually, than the insight itself. It's many, many hours, many, many weeks, days, years, centuries even, of work. But to even have set one foot on that path is already a miracle. And all we have to do is keep going, no matter what it feels like. Even if we feel like we're out in the middle of desert and we have no interest in practicing Zen whatsoever, as happened to me at one point after I've been practicing several years. It turns out that it was really a way of trying to put the brakes on my practice, because once it was shown up to me that I really did want to practice, because what I had experienced during those days in a sesshin were that I had no interest in having a kensho. But that was a superficial attempt to try not to have one. And when I was not accepted to the following sesshin, I realized how badly I did want to awaken and how much it meant, because I had started Zen practice knowing there was no alternative to becoming free of all the stuff, all the pain and suffering that I had experienced in my life. And that is the same for everyone, regardless of what level of pain and suffering they may have experienced in their lives. But there are times in our practice when we try to put on the brakes, as I said, and stop ourselves in the tracks. I saw this many times over when I was at the Rochester Zen Center in the old days. I saw it at Sogenji. It's a classic experience of people. And so it takes a deep vow to continue the practice beyond all the attempts to stall it, to stop it, to avoid it, because our mind will throw up all kinds of attempts to do so. And if we recognize that that's what's going on, it will make a big difference. It's not easy to practice when you feel like that's the last thing in the world you want to do. But here's a cue. When that happens, if it happens, then tune in to what it feels like in your body to not wanting to continue practicing. As I said, I've watched any number of people in my almost 20 years at the Rochester Zen Center come practice for 2, 3, maybe even 5 years. And then they would hit that wall and they would leave. And we wouldn't see them again until maybe 10 years later or even 15 years later. But when they came back, they'd managed to realize that it didn't matter how tall the wall was, they needed to get over it. And they would come back with renewed commitment to practice, and very quickly their practice would go deeper. In my own case, because I knew there was no alternative, I just did the best I could at the time. And to be honest, it wasn't much longer after that incident that I actually was passed on my breakthrough koan. So these things can actually be, like I said, a last-ditch effort for the part of us that wants to stay invested in the status quo, wants to maintain this self-image of being somebody, even as painful as it may be. But if we hang in there anyway, it will make a big difference. And I urge you to do so. Most of us run into some form of that resistance. Some of it is relatively mild, but in my case, it almost stopped me in my tracks. And I've known other people that it did stop in their tracks. They just simply left practice and never returned to it, which is a sad state of affairs from my perspective, because I can recognize how much freer I am from having been willing to stick it out anyway. Of course, that would not have happened if I hadn't realized very clearly that there was nothing in my life, nothing I could do, nothing I could engage in, nothing I could buy, no relationships I could enter that would make any lasting difference in a positive way in my life. That the only way to get that monkey off my back, and I had a big fat monkey on my back then, was to dive into the practice, dive inward, trace the radiance back down to its source. Find that inner spark of truth that lives within everyone. Fan it and let it burn up all the rest, so that you emerge like a phoenix out of the ashes, so much more free. And of course, as I've said so many times, there's a lot of work involved in enacting that freedom. We can see, but if we ignore where we are caught, when we are seeing clearly where we are caught, if we try to disengage from it, if we try to stop it, if we try to shove it under the carpet, if we try to ignore it, if we try to shut it down, it doesn't work. The only way is to walk in and receive the experience, as painful as it can be, as embarrassing as it can be, as uncomfortable as it can be. But that's the only way to releasing it from having any hold on us. Again, everyone has that spark within. Everyone is that radiance. Everyone is that true nature. And the reason we are in practice these days is because at some level, some part of us knows that. And thankfully, as we engage in practice, we have the tools to realize it. So, in these last hours of sesshin, really take a deeper dive, because as a result of all the time you have put into, all the efforts you've put into looking for that spark, turning that eyesight in and tracing down that radiance, even if you haven't arrived at the source, now you have a greater amount of power to do it. But don't kick yourself if it doesn't happen immediately. Progress is always being made as long as you keep trying. And eventually, if you keep trying, you will experience that spark, and it'll grow into a conflagration that will, as I said, burn up all that interferes with that freedom. Thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.